Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. I am not today introducing my co-host Mark Miller. He's got some exciting personal news that I'm sure we'll share in due course. However, I'm extremely excited to be welcoming my guest today, Josh Brahinsky. Josh is a researcher at UC Berkeley in psychology, in the Berkeley Social Interaction Laboratory, and a teaching faculty at UC Santa Cruz. Josh, how are you?
Great. Good to see you.
You as well. I've seen the description of your work as linking the anthropological and neuroscientific methods to explore the ways contemplation invites and shapes our sensory capacity and experience. And I wanted to know, what is another way of saying that? How do you translate that to our listeners?
I think so. I'm an anthropologist, or I'm trained mostly as an anthropologist, and spent probably about 18 years interviewing people, in particular speaking in tongues, about what it feels like. And so there's a whole lot of sort of sensory stuff in the stories that people tell me. And it turns out that that's really key to how they think about what they do and why they do what they do. And then I started meeting people who were neuroscientists who could help me to actually look at it a little bit physiologically. And so we're beginning to do that as well. So it turns out that a lot of the ways that people are thinking about brains and brain plasticity and fluidity in the brain as neuroscientists would probably apply and seem like they apply to people who are speaking in tongues. A lot of the phenomenology is really overlapping, and so it's interesting to look at that and then also see what we can learn from the ways that they have experiences in speaking in tongues that are different than than psychedelic experiences or than meditation experiences or other sort of related kinds of things.
Can you characterize each of those stories roughly? So when the neuroscientists look at this, how do they characterize speaking in tongues, for instance?
Well, what we know better really is that when psychologists look at speaking in tongues, they used to look at it as people being out of their minds and unhealthy and narcissistic. There's a whole set of studies, especially in the 60s, where people were basically debunking it as either just a sort of made-up thing that people just do for social standing. Like there's several studies that show that you can pretend to speak in tongues and it sounds pretty close to speaking in tongues, close enough that it's hard to tell the difference. And so the argument was, well, people are just faking it so that they can get some status in their churches. And then there's a bunch of other psychological studies that say these folks are a little bit abnormal in ways that really are socially problematic. Then there were some folks that started to say, so like Felicitas Goodman and a couple others in the mid-70s began to look at speaking in tongues and say, wait a second, there's something interesting and flexible here. There's something about the way that they think that seems a little outside of how we usually think. And she got very excited, and a couple other anthropologists got excited about studying it as a positive thing that could be, basically she studied trance. Erica Borgen-Young and a whole group of anthropologists and psychologists got excited about trance as a positive thing that was happening all over the world. Now, late 70s, that gets basically shut down, and especially when on the psychological side of things. And so now that there's this psychedelic renaissance that's happening, where people are sort of reawakening to the possibility that you can do things to your brain that make it more flexible and that could be healthy, and the story is being told in a way that has a lot more possibility for social change and for personal growth and that sort of thing. We have a chance to look at speaking in tongues again. And so Michael Lifshitz, who's a neuroscientist at McGill, and myself and Tanya Lerman, who's an anthropologist at Stanford, have begun to do that process with, we're doing studies of people speaking in tongues that includes ethnography, so includes like years and years of hanging out with people, includes phenomenological interviews, which are really, some people call it microphenomenology, but it's these like intensive 3 to 5 hour interviews about people's experience, and you really get into the finely grained stories, which hopefully I'll tell you some of them on this podcast. And then also the neurophysiology. And the neurophysiology is just emerging, so I'm going to talk more about the stories today. But the tale that's being told about psychedelics right now, where people say, okay, loosen your priors, your brain gets to think new thoughts, is one that seems very likely to be true. It's a similar shift that happened with psychedelic research. That that's the same story that you could tell about Felicitas Goodman and Erica Borgen-Young around speaking in tongues, where there's a change and a potential for thinking about it as something that people actually learn and grow with. But it hasn't happened yet with speaking in tongues in the last 10 years. So in the new paradigm.
It's interesting. So we actually had Michael on the podcast, and one of the things that came out of that conversation that I'm interested in asking you about here is when the medical and psychological community is essentially hearing tongues or trance states as bad or abnormal, to what degree do you think that's because it's not coming from a religious context? Like, my understanding of things like speaking in tongues is that there are cultural contexts, religious contexts, where they have a lot of meaning. But then if you're looking from the lens of if you're looking through a lens that doesn't have that, is that why you see them be effectively called bad and abnormal?
No, I think it's actually, I think the religious context hurts I think the religious context is part of the critique. So Pentecostals, who are the people who are known, most for speaking in tongues, it's hard to know this, but if you're not in the world that they're in, but this is a group that has grown massively. So in the last 100 years, they've gone from a few thousand people to something like 500 million people around the world. So it's a huge movement, but somehow it's been pretty successful at keeping itself separate from the secular world and other religious movements. So people don't know what they're doing, but they just every once in a while get an image of someone sort of falling on the floor or running around wildly or yelling like a chicken, which, these are things that do happen in Pentecostal churches. There's an incredible emotional release and a lot of ecstatic and highly aroused behavior, and it's seen as just a part of why they should be sort of shunned. And then you add the really intense right-wing piece of it, which is not something that was always true. So Pentecostals in early 1900s were often feminist, anti-racist, progressive environmentalists, anti-war. They were pacifists. They were fringe to society, but fringe from a sort of from the progressive side. It wasn't really until the mid-1920s when this sort of strong white supremacy became a big piece of white Pentecostalism, and when after the Vietnam War, that nationalism and that sort of thing became part of Pentecostalism as well. So the right-wing move is not necessarily part of the movement. Like, it's not something that is required for someone. You don't have to be a right-winger to be a Pentecostal, but because there's such a strong connection between Pentecostalism now and right-wing movements. I mean, the stuff in Uganda right now, the anti-gay bills, it's very much coming out of the Pentecostal movement there. And that connection makes it seem even more fringe.
It's interesting, though, because from the outside, you would never have assumed that connection was traditionally with the left. The fringeness emerged from its association with being anti-war and liberal. That's like a shock to hear.
Yeah, right? No, I know. It was very surprising to me when I started studying them, and I was like, there's all sorts of debates about speaking in tongues and Pentecostalism, and some people will say people have been doing it forever, and some people will say people have been doing it since Acts, which is a book in the Bible. This movement today, the one that is all around the world right now, really had a big sort of opening in 1906. And in 1906, there was this African-American pastor. He was disabled. He went to Los Angeles, and he said, we're going to have this new moment where we're all going to feel the Spirit of God in our bodies. Let's do it. And he started this little church. It's called the Azusa Street Revival. And hundreds of people just had wild experiences, and then people came from all over the world to see it and to be part of it, and they got very excited, and they went running all around the world telling people about it too. But this was like interracial, there were women leading this movement, which was very unusual at the time. And they were literally challenging all of the structures of society. It was like, we can break out of society. We're having a direct experience of God. We don't need to listen to the rules. So much so there were groups of people that were saying, We think marriage is a bad idea, right? We think, we think that we should never go to war. We think the government is a problem. We think we need to really change gender roles. It's very different than what you think of when you think of right-wing Christianity today.
What is where does the anthropological story and the neuroscientific story meet when it comes to something like having those experiences?
So then to take it back to the stories, yeah. Well, why don't can I tell you a story or two? Yeah, okay. So what I did was I've gone to churches. I've been doing this for 18 years at, close to a dozen different churches, but a couple of them where I spent a lot of time at. And so there was a church where we did extended interviews with 35 people, and they were really focused on people's spiritual experience. And so what I'm going to tell you this story, and this is a story about what I think you could call ego dissolution, or at least I think it's in that realm. And so Pablo is the guy I'm interviewing, and he's like the warmest man you've ever met. Like, I met him, and the minute he met me, he gave me this huge hug, and just starts storytelling, and he sits back, and so I sit back and I'm interviewing him. He grew up in an African-American neighborhood in San Francisco, spends his summers with a grandma in Merced, which is a small town in the Central Valley of California, and he worshipped in a church like 5 mornings a week throughout the summer, but then it wasn't so active back home in San Francisco. His grandma dies when he's 11, and he's furious with the world, with fate. He gives up his religion. He throws grocery carts off highway bridges. He starts fighting on the street, and he's like an amazing boxer because his uncle was the champion in the California Prison Boxing League. So he's like this like intense boxer and angry, but at the same time somehow he's doing straight A academics, right? And so he gets to UC Berkeley. My point is that this is a highly driven person, right? And he has this wild experience. He goes to Berkeley, and you can see how driven he is because he's back home in San Francisco, which is close to Berkeley, and there's a sweep of his neighborhood, and this was like Clinton era sweeps of black neighborhoods to catch people with drugs. One of his friends who he's playing basketball with has drugs. He's got marijuana, but they can't bust him because he's too young, so they bust Pablo instead. He goes to court, and this wild thing happens, which is that the morning of his trial, the police who were set up to, the ones who caught him, get busted for cocaine that morning. And so the judge calls him in and says, "What is this? You have 60 character witnesses. This is really unusual. And the 3 cops that, caught you were just busted for cocaine. I'd like to just make a deal with you and let you off, right? I'll give you a month of community service instead of an arrest. You're clearly a kid who's going to do great in the world, and I want to support you in this, right?" And Pablo's like, "To hell with you. I don't accept this. Like, this is like, I'm doing this myself, and you're just, part of this messed up state system." And he refuses the community service, ends up going to jail for a month. Just like, the guy is intense, right? And then he moves to LA, becomes a music producer, super successful. He's actually working with Michael Jackson. He was working with other really famous musicians. And he comes back to God when he finds a gospel singer that he's producing, and they fall in love. And anyways, when he comes back to God, the way he tells it, he said, "I was pushing myself. I was being super successful. I was making it in the world in a whole bunch of ways, but it was all about me. It was all about me performing and me making it and being sort of really good at what I do. So I came to God and I let myself go." And he talks about this. He starts worshiping again, and it's a physical thing. This is what's really interesting to me. He's for one day, he says, "I was being pressed down. I first tried to get up and was like, nope. Usually I want to be in control, but I feel my body thrown to the ground, and my body's hot. Like, have you ever seen how an iron rod, when it's put in a fire, it turns blue?" This is what he's telling me. It felt like my body was blue all over and burning. And shortly after that, I started to speak in a different language. So this was him speaking in tongues. And now speaking in tongues is It's been studied in a bunch of different ways. There's a debate over whether it has anything to do with any language structure, but at least the social scientists who study it have shown that it's a nonsense. It's nonsense words, but that seem to put people in a different state of mind and state of body. So he's speaking in tongues and he's burning up, and he says, in this moment, as soon as I started to dethrone myself more and more and enthrone who I call God, my life starts to change in a lot of other areas. So I'm not being so intense where I deal with people, how people deal with me, my relationships. I was butting heads, my parenting, my patience, it all changes, right? So he's softening in relationship to this dethroning. Now, dethroning, if you think of the research on psychedelics, people use the word decentering, right? And that's with mindfulness as well. I think probably they're the same concept, right? He's taking himself out of the center of the story and putting God there instead. Which is different than the mindfulness stories where you take yourself out of the story and there's nothing, right? The goal is that there's nothing left. And I don't know what the difference is. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting differences between speaking in tongues and psychedelic work, or speaking in tongues and mindfulness, is that the ego dissolution is not just dissolving into nothingness. It's dissolving into a relationship with a specific sentient being, right? They're imagining God as an entity. And that's different in the mind, right? Theory of mind activation patterns are different than other patterns. Like when you think someone else has a mind, your brain does really particular things. And those particular things are actually, in some ways, the opposite of what's happening when people are, many of the recent studies on mindfulness and psychedelics talk about default mode deactivation, right? The theory of mind areas are essentially default mode. And so you're activating them in your theory of mind. So there's these two crossing patterns in the brain. And we're trying to figure out what exactly that means, because the phenomenology of speaking in tongues, right, is very similar to the phenomenology of like a microdose of psychedelics, right? People are feeling themselves decentered. They're feeling themselves renewed. They're having what you would call hallucinations, right? If you're not evangelical, right? They're having experiences, sensory experiences that are very tactile and real to them. So it sounds very much like a psychedelic experience, and yet in the brain they're having this cross, right, between a God and really focused on a God, and then the release that comes with it.
In your experience, how do people account for the difference? Because it seems like the similarity in the phenomenology would lead to similar brain patterns happening. Why is the opposite, as you've put it, going on there?
I mean, so this is what we're trying to figure out, right? And we actually don't have an answer yet. So we're in the midst of like the neuroscience side of it. What we can see from phenomenology is that people are having, I mean, there's a couple experiences that are different. So when I was talking about Pablo, in the end of his experience, so his experience goes like this. It's high arousal, right? You start speaking in tongues, it's intensity, there's a furor, maybe like a white noise kind of experience. I mean, there's different ways to think about this, but there's something sort of excited going on. And then they do what's called dropping in. So dropping in is something that's not theological, but it's something that we discovered in our research, which is we asked, is, when you're speaking in tongues, is the experience constant? And everybody we talked to said, well, about 30 seconds or maybe a minute or maybe 2 minutes in, I have a massive shift where God takes over, I release, things quiet down. That's when I can really hear the voice of God speaking. And we started, they actually started calling it drop-ins, and so we started calling it drop-ins. And everybody I've interviewed, we did 25 interviews after the fMRIs, they all had this experience of drop-ins. And so we're trying to figure out how to measure that. We have a little bit of measuring. So there's a arousal, then there's a release, and there's a quieting. And then afterwards, there's this incredible sense of power. So Pablo said, I felt like I was a superhero. It feels like metal in my veins, almost like the X-Men. I can't even explain it. It's almost like I have too much energy in my body. And that's part of what's happening there as well. So there's a bunch of layers, and I think those layers give us really good questions to ask when you're looking at other people's experiences of trance-like things,
Across cultures, and now if we jump to cultures that wouldn't recognize God in the sort of evangelical context we spoke about earlier, do they have similar phenomenology when they have speaking in tongues?
Well, there's debates about this, and I don't think we have a full answer yet. I know that there are people that talk about light languages, there are people that talk about fairy languages, there are shamanic experiences where people speak nonsense words, and I haven't been able to I'm in the process of collecting interviews from those people and trying to figure out, okay, how close is this, right? So the interesting thing with evangelicals, right, is that people didn't really study it, like they weren't open to being studied until recently. And there's a recent move within evangelicalism where they're like, well, God's got to work through the body somehow, right? So we can study this physiologically, and that does nothing to debunk, God could be part of this, or God, like as a scientist, for me, that's not the question, right? Is God part of it or not? I don't have to answer that question. And what I found is that the people that I'm working with now don't need me to answer the question because they can answer it for themselves. It allows them, there's an opening there, right? God could create our body. However, if there's a God, God creates the body and creates the neurophysiology the way, he or she or whatever wants to. In terms of, so the question then is, how important is the God part to this experience, or how important is the sentient being to this experience? It's interesting. I actually, I've met a couple people recently who seem to have speaking in tongues experiences that seem quite similar, that are just based on awe, AWE, like the experience of something bigger. And there's all this research. So Dr. Keltner is the one who runs the lab that I work in at Berkeley, and he studies awe in all different kinds of contexts. And his basic argument is that when you feel the experience of being small and something's really big around you, there's neurophysiological shifts, there's a whole bunch of health effects, and that there's a whole lot of stuff in the world that is generated by this awe experience. So if he's right, and if these people who I'm meeting now who are talking about speaking in tongues based on just awe are right, then that's a big piece of what's going on when people are worshiping God, right? God is really big. And that's one of the main things that they say is, this is just so much bigger than me, and this is so much, I'm so small in the face of God. That's a big piece of the experience that's described. So that might be one of the major mechanisms, and that would make it a mechanism that's translatable across contexts. But it would be different, right? Like I would imagine, this is one of the questions in terms of like process and effect. I would imagine that there's something different about a focus on one being than the oceanic melting into the whole world, right? You just blend with one. And, maybe that's what sex is like too. Maybe there's a bunch of places in the world where you are merging with just one entity. And I imagine that's different than merging with everything. And actually the people that I work with, the evangelicals, really don't like the language around mysticism. So when I say to them, do you blend with the world? They're like, no, that's mystic. Like, we're not mystics, right? We don't lose ourselves. We gain ourselves in our relationship to God. And we blend with God, and ourselves become stronger.
Yeah, like I've got two conflicting thoughts here, two
Yeah.
dynamics that bump heads. On the one hand, it makes sense that a difference in ontological beliefs. Am I a mystic who thinks there's many gods, or God is or do I think God is a single God? It seems like that would be, because the brain is so predictive, what your expectations are and what your belief system is would have some effect on the experience. The other side feels like, well, the mechanics of this, as unclear as they are exactly, when you hear people talk about, or I'm just so small, or we're all connected, they do have a texture that's shared with the experiences of psychedelic or evangelical, and passing apart two things at the same time. One, how much do the ontological beliefs matter? And two, what is it like when there's no ontology, right? Because it might be that you go in not just as not an evangelical, but also not a mystic. You're just a hardcore secular atheist. But nonetheless, like, something's been inspiring. I wonder if you take those three cases, whether the brain looks different and whether the exact experience around things like dropping in looks different?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We don't have a full answer. I don't think anybody goes in without an ontology. I think they have one. I think secularism is its own ontology, and there's a bunch of literature on secularism that shows that the secular, often at least, is, and at least in the U.S., the sort of strong secularism tends to have a kind of Protestant sense of time and sense of being and sense of how things work, and you know, you could look at that and think about that too, but not an evangelical one. And so I do think you're right. Like, and I'm an anthropologist, so like of course I'm going to be like, these things matter. It's been actually really interesting talking to neuroscientists, because I'll run into neuroscientists who are like, it must be all the same. And I'll be like, well, this has been a debate that's been going on in religious studies for like decades. It's the perennialists versus the, you know, particularists. And the perennialists are like, religion is one thing. Excuse me. Religion is one thing, and it is the same in Christianity, and the same in Islam, and the same in Judaism, and the same in, you know, all the different Hinduisms, and the same in all the different Buddhisms. And I'm sure there's something similar, right? And I'm sure there's something different. The question for me, I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is what is really different when you go in saying, I'm gonna just blend with God, or I'm going to lose my whole self, right? I'm just going to merge and become part of the sea of the world. That seems like a really awesome question. And given that neuroscientists today are saying, okay, part of what makes psychedelics work is the releasing of the self, right? Like, that's part of the central sort of functional principle at the moment, is ego dissolution is something we're using to heal people so that they can rebuild their ego, right? Or so they can have a new ego or a different ego, or get rid of past patterns. So then it becomes actually a really salient question. Like, to what degree does the belief that your ego is not going to dissolve affect that process? Or to what degree does the belief that your ego only merges with this particular God affect that process? So in terms of health effects, I think it's huge. And I think we really have no idea what that is. But I think it does point to something that psychedelic folks are not really studying. Like, the whole sort of psychedelic renaissance is missing, to at least a large degree, the question of reintegration and how exactly. I mean, we're talking about set and setting and how that affects people, but people who are evangelical are born again. That's the central thing they're doing. They're not dissolving. They're they're going through rebirth, right? And when they speak in tongues, those are little versions of rebirth, again and again and again and again. And, you know, that can sound completely beautiful, right? That's like an amazing way to change and be flexible and fluid. It can also sound like absolute openness to a very rigid theology, right? Depending on where it's happening and what the setting is. So it's got these very different impulses that are pushing against each other constantly. But I do think it teaches us, okay, well, let's look at that question, right?
It is interesting because it just totally depends on the lens of the conversation. I understand how the debate became particularists versus, what was the other one?
Perennialists.
Perennialists, yeah, because, right, like, you know, I've done a lot of meditation, and in the sort of Buddhist framework, with that lens on, I can see there'd be quite harsh rejections of forms of language that point the other way. And I'm trying to work out, do the frameworks lead us astray when it comes to assessing the phenomenology? Or are they kind of the organized lenses onto which you can't understand the phenomenology otherwise?
Right, exactly. And I think that, I mean, that's you know, like Michael Lifshitz, who, I don't know if, did he talk about imagination when he was on this podcast?
No, he didn't.
Oh, okay, because Michael and I are constantly talking about, so you can think of frameworks as the kind, and I think this is really his idea, that's why I want to point to him, but, you know, that frameworks are things that bind you, right, or things that constrain you. But frameworks are also things that give your imagination space to play. And if you're thinking in the Buddhist vein, where imagination is all just excess and not part of the real, right, and not important, and your job is to really get rid of it, then those imaginary things become a problem and they become a burden. And I think that's absolutely one way to look at it. And then the other way is like, well, okay, we're going to use this imagination to get ourselves to a mountain in our minds. We're going to use this imagination to help us. I mean, there's so many imaginative forms of prayer and of meditation in the world that, you know, could be wonderful and interesting and exciting and get you to different places. And so I think part of the, I guess, sort of the argument that comes out of this is like, is there, you know, can we be open to these multiple versions of using our minds to shape our bodies and not just using our minds to empty them?
Right, and you know, just there's an analogy here, right? Like they say creativity is very, very hard without set limitations.
Right.
Paint is a very hard instruction, but paint, an experience of trauma abstractly, is a very easy instruction, relatively speaking, if you don't know what you're going to paint.
Right.
And similarly, I can see that the frameworks can have this dual effect of giving us an opportunity to interpret the phenomenology. But it is interesting, as you say, that you could have two traditions who will disagree on what's going on.
Yeah, in a really big way.
Outside. Yeah.
I mean, I think of it like jazz. I'm a jazz musician, right? So anybody who's played jazz, right? There's a structure, and you improvise within it. And I do have a friend who's plays free jazz. We played a gig together once, and it was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. I'm a bass player, and he's a saxophone player. And if I were in the free jazz mode, that would have been great. But we were trying to play songs. It's got some of those same questions, right? You know, how much structure is structure at all useful in this process, and structures of thought and structures of imagination, and then it seems to me inevitable that structure is going to affect the brain, and so then the question is, do we have a, you know, in this, I mean, I'd put it really simply, like in the psychedelic renaissance where there's an idealization of ego dissolution as the thing that gets you to sort of a mystical experience, or that's part of a mystical experience that allows your priors to be loosened and have, you know, give you new thoughts, and that's therapeutic, right? That's the ideal model that we're looking at. Then what role do expectations play? What role does imagination play? And how does that, you know, how can we use that to heal ourselves and to care for ourselves and to think in new ways? And then also for me, really specifically, like, I think the evangelical world has incredible possibility, as well as, you know, possibility for good and for bad. It's one of the evangelicals I talked to said it's like Spider-Man, and that, you know, there's with great power comes great responsibility. So if you can do this thing to yourself, right? If you could take your brain and loosen it, and come up with new ways of thinking, and then you can do it together as a community. And that can generate an incredible capacity for love and care. That's amazing. And if you can do it, and it can generate an incredible capacity for drawing boundaries and hating people, that's really interesting too. Those are both versions of power that come from flexible brains. And I mean, I actually think that's another one of the lessons for the psychedelic renaissance as well, which is that people are like, okay, we're going to make our brains flexible. That's great if you're in a loving atmosphere. But if you're teaching yourself, you know, if you make your brains really flexible, and part of what's going on is everyone's like, you know, we really think those immigrants are awful, and you're saying that when you're in that flexible state, that's maybe not so great.
Yeah, flexibility is not indicative of an outcome. It's a meta skill. It's the thing that gets you to...
Exactly. Yeah, and it becomes really clear when you see these different groups of people going in very different directions with what could be very similar capacities.
Josh, where can everyone find you online?
You can't really. I mean, you know, academia.edu is about as good as it gets, but I don't have a web presence. You look up Josh Brahinsky, you'll find a bunch of articles that I've written. Yeah.
Brilliant, man. Listen, that was so much fun.
Excellent. Well, fun talking to you too. Thanks.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. That was Josh Brahinsky. And as always, we'll be back next week.